40,000 years ago, Europe was home to a human that was not us. They had survived multiple ice ages. Their bodies carried the healed fractures of a life spent in close contact with some of the most dangerous animals on the planet. Their brains were, if anything, slightly larger than ours. They buried their dead, cared for the injured among them, and built tools and materials that required knowledge passed deliberately from one generation to the next. For more than 300,000 years, across some of the harshest landscapes this planet has ever produced, they endured, and then, within a blink in geological time, they were gone. When the first Neanderthal skull was examined in the 1850s, the doctor who studied it concluded the individual must have been severely diseased, deformed, suffering, barely functional. The diagnosis seemed to explain the strange, heavy bones. The diagnosis was wrong. The bones were normal. That was simply what this species looked like. The first encounter science had with a Neanderthal was to mistake it for a broken human. That mistake shaped how we thought about them for a century. And in some ways, we are still correcting it. Because despite more than 150 years of research, fossils, genetics, archaeology, climate records, no one has been able to say with certainty what ended them. A species that survived everything the Ice Age could throw at it simply disappeared. And the question of why is one of the most debated and most personal in all of human science. Personal because the answer, whatever it is, says something about us too. Today, we examine every major theory, every key fossil discovery, and every piece of genetic evidence in the search for what happened to Earth's strongest humans. But before we do, let me know in the comments. Are you listening to this to fall asleep, or you're here only for the knowledge? Now, let's begin. Across Eurasia, traces of Neanderthal lives appear in layers of sediment, scattered through valleys, coastlines, mountain foothills, and limestone shelters. Taken individually, each site seems small, a hearth here, a stone tool there, a fragment of bone resting beneath thousands of years of accumulated earth. Viewed together, they reveal something much larger, a human lineage whose history stretched across an astonishing span of geography and time. Their story began hundreds of thousands of years before the first cities, before agriculture, before any written record. Sometime between roughly 600,000 and 800,000 years ago, a population descended from earlier human ancestors moved outward from Africa into Eurasia. Generation after generation encountered colder winters, unfamiliar animals, shifting landscapes, and climates unlike those of their ancestral homeland. Through that immense stretch of time, natural selection gradually shaped a distinct form of humanity, adapted to life across the northern reaches of the world. By at least 400,000 years ago, recognizable Neanderthals had emerged in the fossil record. Their presence would continue through changing ages of ice and warmth, through environmental transformations that repeatedly altered the very shape of continents. During their peak occupation, their range extended from the Atlantic shores of Portugal and Britain to the Altai Mountains of Siberia. This territory covered roughly 26 million square kilometers, an area larger than the African continent itself. Such scale can create the illusion of uniformity, though the evidence points elsewhere. A Neanderthal community living near the western edge of Europe experienced a world different from one occupying the grasslands of Central Asia or the woodlands of the Near East. Regional differences appeared in anatomy, tool traditions, and daily adaptations, reflecting local environments and long periods of geographic separation. Like modern humans, they existed as interconnected populations shaped by the places they called home. The world they inhabited belonged to the Pleistocene, a period marked by extraordinary climatic instability. Ice sheets advanced and retreated across northern latitudes. Forests expanded, vanished, and returned. Rivers changed course. Coastlines migrated with fluctuating sea levels. Entire ecosystems shifted position across the landscape within spans that, in evolutionary terms, arrived with startling speed. Neanderthals endured these changes again and again. Communities adapted to conditions that rarely remained constant for long. Habitats opened and contracted. Migration routes appeared and disappeared. Prey species followed the movement of vegetation across immense distances, and human populations adjusted in response. Popular imagery often confines Neanderthals to caves, though archaeology paints a broader picture. Caves offered shelter when available, preserving evidence especially well for modern researchers. Beyond those protected spaces, Neanderthals occupied open plains, river corridors, woodland edges, and coastal regions. They hunted, gathered resources, raised children, and navigated environments extending far beyond cave entrances. For approximately 300,000 years, they persisted through climatic upheavals that would challenge any civilization alive today. Their lineage survived repeated cycles of environmental stress while maintaining a presence across one of the largest territories ever occupied by a human species. This was no fragile population lingering at the margins of survival. It was an enduring human dynasty, established across continents and tested by ages of change. For hundreds of millennia, the dynasty held. Then the world introduced a circumstance it had never faced before. Anatomy leaves signatures that survive long after names, voices, and memories disappear. In museums and research collections, a trained anthropologist can identify a Neanderthal skeleton almost immediately. The recognition comes from proportions and structure, from a body plan so distinct that even isolated bones often announce their origin before formal measurement begins. The framework itself appears constructed for demands unfamiliar to most modern humans. Cortical bone, the dense outer layer that forms the walls of major skeletal elements, was substantially thicker than in our own species. These were bones exposed to repeated mechanical stress, reinforced through both inheritance and a lifetime of intense physical exertion. Encounters with large prey occurred at close range, where the difference between success and injury could be measured in fractions of a second. The skeleton carried the marks of a world in which impact was routine. Body mass tells a similar story. A Neanderthal standing beside a modern person of equal height would appear broader in almost every dimension. The rib cage expanded outward, the pelvis widened, and the limbs attached to a trunk built around strength rather than efficiency of movement across long distances. Weight concentrated close to the ground created a stable center of gravity, useful when confronting animals capable of weighing several tons. Within the chest, another adaptation emerges. The thorax possessed a distinctive funnel like form that allowed large volumes of cold, dry air to move through the respiratory system. Across Ice Age environments, every breath required conditioning before reaching delicate lung tissue. Enlarged nasal passages and extensive sinus cavities functioned as biological heat exchangers, warming and humidifying incoming air before it descended deeper into the body. The architecture of the face itself participated in survival. Hands reveal an equally striking pattern. The arrangement of bones and muscle attachment sites indicates exceptional gripping ability. Researchers studying these structures have compared the likely force output to that of elite modern athletes, though the comparison remains imperfect because few living occupations place such constant demands on the hands. Stone tools, animal hides, wooden shafts, plant fibers, and prey animals all required sustained force generation across countless daily tasks. Evidence continues downward through the legs. Femurs and lower limb bones display remodeling associated with repeated muscular loading. Bone is living tissue, responding to stress throughout life. In Neanderthals, that response reached levels commonly associated today with highly trained explosive athletes. Every step, climb, carry, and hunt contributed to a skeleton continually adapting to intense workloads. Even the teeth participated in labor. Microscopic wear patterns and damage across the front dentition suggest regular use as a gripping tool. Hides could be held taut while being processed. Fibers might be stabilized during manufacturing tasks. Materials passed repeatedly between hands and teeth, turning the mouth into an additional working surface. The cost of such a lifestyle appears in injury patterns. Healed fractures occur throughout the fossil record at frequencies comparable to modern professions involving frequent collisions with large animals. Many individuals recovered from broken bones and returned to daily activity, carrying the evidence for the remainder of their lives. Inside the skull rested another unexpected dimension. Male brain volume averaged around 1,640 cubic centimeters. Female averages approached 1,460 cubic centimeters. Both figures exceed the average volume observed in living human populations today. Taken together, these features form a portrait of extraordinary physical capability, a lineage shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of selection in demanding environments. The image that emerges carries a weight difficult to ignore, a species seemingly built beyond modern limits, existing in a form that makes its eventual disappearance feel almost impossible. Ideas leave a different kind of fossil. Stone can preserve the shape of a hand, but knowledge survives only when it alters the material world in ways that endure. For much of the past century, researchers looked at Neanderthal artifacts and saw little more than evidence of survival. Popular culture carried that interpretation even further, transforming an extinct human relative into a symbol of ignorance and crude behavior. The deeper the archaeological record became, the harder that image was to sustain. Among the strongest pieces of evidence lies in the Mousterian tool tradition, named after the site of Le Moustier in France. These tools were not random fragments struck from stone. Flint cores were prepared through carefully planned sequences, each strike influencing the next. A successful toolmaker needed to anticipate fracture angles hidden within the stone before a single blow was delivered. Such skill demanded practice measured in years. Across more than 200,000 years, the system remained effective enough to persist across enormous distances and changing environments. Recent discoveries have expanded that picture further. Research published in 2024 confirmed the production of complex adhesives made from pine tar mixed with ochre in controlled proportions. Creating such a substance required managing heat, selecting ingredients, and combining them in a repeatable process. Each stage depended on learned knowledge passed between individuals. No visible feature of pine bark suggests that it can become a useful adhesive through controlled heating. The result emerges only through experimentation and transmission of technique. Fragments of twisted plant fiber recovered from a French site offer another glimpse into this intellectual world. The cordage predates any comparable example currently known from Homo sapiens contexts. Rope appears deceptively simple until one considers what it requires. Fibers must be selected, prepared, twisted in a consistent direction, then combined under controlled tension. The finished product embodies an understanding of material behavior that exists first in the mind before it appears in the hands. Evidence of abstract thought surfaces in places where practical explanations become difficult. At La Roche-Cotard in France, geometric engravings cut into rock were sealed beneath sediments dating to at least 57,000 years ago. The markings predate the arrival of modern humans in the region by more than 10,000 years. Their meaning remains unknown, yet intention is visible in every line. Someone invested time and effort into creating a pattern that served a purpose beyond immediate survival. Objects gathered from across Europe point towards symbolic behavior as well. Eagle talons bearing signs of modification appear at multiple sites. Some were perforated, suggesting use as personal ornaments. Collections of black feathers from different bird species reveal a striking selectivity. Food acquisition alone offers little reason to favor one color repeatedly across separate locations. The pattern hints at preferences, traditions, or associations that archaeology cannot fully recover. Even traces trapped within mineralized dental plaque contribute to the picture. Chemical analysis has identified plants such as yarrow and groundsel, species known for anti inflammatory and pain relieving properties. These plants were not major food sources. Their presence suggests targeted use, knowledge accumulated through observation and experience across generations. As each discovery joins the growing record, the old caricature continues to dissolve. The discussion has moved beyond whether Neanderthals possessed sophisticated cognition. Their tools, materials, ornaments, and plant knowledge indicate that they did. The remaining challenge lies in measuring the portions of their intellectual world that left no surviving trace at all. A damaged skeleton can sometimes reveal more about a society than a healthy one. Broken bones, healed wounds, and bodies carried through years of hardship preserve traces of decisions made by people who left no written record. Few places demonstrate this more clearly than Shanidar Cave, nestled within the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq. During excavations conducted in the 1950s and 1960s, archaeologist Ralph Selecki uncovered the remains of 10 Neanderthal individuals. Their burials spanned tens of thousands of years, creating a rare window into lives lived between approximately 65,000 and 35,000 years ago. The discoveries transformed scientific understanding of Neanderthal social behavior, shifting attention away from tools and hunting toward relationships between individuals. Among the most famous finds was Shanidar I, an adult male who died somewhere between 30 and 45 years of age. His skeleton carried a remarkable history of survival. A severe injury to the skull likely left him partially blind in his left eye. His right arm had suffered profound damage, becoming withered and largely unusable below the elbow. One leg showed evidence of long term deformity. Degenerative joint disease affected parts of his body, and hearing loss may also have accompanied him through later life. None of those conditions caused his immediate death. The bones show healing. Some injuries had healed so completely that they must have occurred many years before the end of his life. That detail changes everything. A person carrying such disabilities would have struggled with tasks central to Neanderthal existence: hunting large animals, traveling across rugged terrain, gathering resources, processing carcasses, and maintaining daily survival all demanded physical capability. Shanidar I lived on, despite limitations that would have profoundly altered his contribution to the group. His continued survival points toward repeated acts of assistance. Food must have reached him during periods when obtaining it independently would have been difficult. Protection, companionship, and practical support were extended over years, perhaps decades. Such care required time and energy from others whose own lives depended upon limited resources. The evidence records a community willing to absorb that cost. Another individual, Shanidar III, offers a related glimpse into social resilience. A puncture wound to the ribs, consistent with a spear injury, healed before death. Recovery from such trauma would have involved a prolonged period of vulnerability. Once again, survival implies sustained support from those around him while the body repaired itself. Nearby lay Shanidar 4, associated with one of the most discussed discoveries in paleoanthropology. Clusters of pollen from 8 plant species were found around the burial. Several of those plants possess medicinal properties, including yarrow, ephedra, and groundsel. Debate continues regarding how the pollen arrived there. Rodent activity remains one possible explanation. Intentional burial, however, is broadly accepted, and the association between people, plants, and death remains a compelling element of the site. Beyond Shanidar, similar patterns emerge across the Neanderthal world. Elderly individuals survived advanced arthritis. Adults recovered from major injuries. Infants were placed into the ground with apparent care. These discoveries appear too frequently and across too many locations to dismiss as coincidence. The bones from Shanidar preserve more than anatomy, they preserve choices. Again and again, those choices point toward communities that invested effort in members who could no longer repay that effort through physical strength alone. Within those acts rests a deeply human conclusion. These were people who had decided that illness did not erase a person's value, and that the vulnerable deserved a place within the group. Scale can be deceptive. A map shaded to show Neanderthal territory creates the impression of abundance, a human presence stretching from Atlantic coastlines to the heart of Siberia. The occupied landscape covered roughly 26 million square kilometers, an area so immense that it seems capable of supporting countless communities. The reality was far stranger. At their greatest extent, the total Neanderthal population across Europe and Western Asia was probably no more than 150,000 individuals. Spread across that enormous territory, they existed at densities almost unimaginable today. A person could travel for days, perhaps weeks, without encountering another group. Entire valleys, forests, grasslands, and river systems may have stood empty of human presence for long periods. Genetic studies sharpen the picture further. Population size and breeding population are not the same thing. Many individuals leave no descendants, while others contribute disproportionately to future generations. Estimates of the effective breeding population, the number actively passing genes forward, sometimes fall between 1,000 and 10,000 individuals across the entire Neanderthal world, for a species occupying such a vast geographic range. Those figures are astonishingly small. The mathematics become clearer when compared with the modern world. Their average population density has been estimated at approximately 0.0002 individuals per square kilometer. Mongolia, often cited as the least densely populated nation on Earth today, supports roughly 2.07 people per square kilometer. The difference reaches around 10,000-fold. Human presence in the Neanderthal world was dispersed across the landscape like scattered points of light, separated by immense distances. Daily life unfolded within bands commonly numbering between 15 and 25 individuals. These groups formed the practical unit of survival. They hunted together, shared resources, cared for children, and carried knowledge through generations. Contact with neighboring bands occurred, though the archaeological record suggests such encounters were infrequent compared with the interconnected societies familiar today. Distance imposed its own constraints. Reaching another group often meant traversing hundreds of kilometers of challenging terrain. Seasonal weather, shifting prey movements, rivers, mountains, and simple uncertainty all limited regular interaction. A community facing hardship could not assume assistance would arrive from elsewhere. In many cases, there may have been no nearby population capable of providing it. Under those conditions, demographic losses carried unusual weight. Within a band of 20 individuals, the death of 2 or 3 adults of reproductive age represented far more than personal tragedy. It altered future birth rates, labor capacity, knowledge transmission, and social stability simultaneously. Recovery could take generations, assuming recovery remained possible at all. Material culture preserves traces of this isolation. Stone tool traditions varied noticeably between regions. Certain techniques flourished in one area while remaining absent elsewhere. These differences accumulated through time, suggesting populations often developed local practices independently. Innovations did not always spread across the continent. Knowledge frequently remained where it originated. Viewed together, the evidence reveals a species existing close to demographic limits. Their communities were resilient enough to persist across immense spans of time, yet resilience differs from security. A population dispersed into small, widely separated groups possesses little reserve against additional strain. Every setback carries greater consequences when numbers are already low. Across hundreds of thousands of years, those long intervals of separation shaped more than culture and geography. They also left their mark within the genome itself, written generation by generation into the biological inheritance carried forward by the descendants of each isolated band. Genes carry memories that no stone tool can preserve. Every generation inherits a biological record assembled from countless births, deaths, migrations, and chance events stretching far into the past. Within Neanderthal DNA, researchers have found evidence of a long demographic history written not in words, but in patterns of similarity repeated across entire genomes. One of the clearest examples emerged from research published in 2024 by scientists at the University of Copenhagen. Examining the genome of a Neanderthal male recovered from a cave in southern France, the team identified signs of inbreeding extending across multiple generations. This was not an isolated family history. The pattern appeared embedded within the structure of the population itself, reflecting communities that remained small and separated for extended periods. To understand why this mattered, it helps to consider genetic variation. Every individual inherits 2 copies of most genes, one from each parent. In large, diverse populations, those copies often differ from one another. Geneticists call this heterozygosity. Diversity provides resilience because one healthy copy can compensate when the other carries a harmful mutation. Within highly isolated populations, that protective flexibility begins to erode. Related individuals share more of the same genetic variants, increasing the likelihood that both copies of a gene will be identical. Harmful recessive mutations that might remain harmless in a diverse population become more likely to express themselves. Generation after generation, these effects can accumulate. The process unfolds gradually. No single birth transforms a population. No single generation creates a crisis. The changes emerge through repetition, each cycle narrowing the range of available variation. A lineage may continue functioning for thousands of years while carrying an increasingly heavy genetic burden. Evidence for this pattern reaches far back into Neanderthal history. Analysis of the semicircular canals within fossil ear bones has revealed signs of a severe population bottleneck around 110,000 years ago. These delicate structures preserve developmental information that can reflect demographic changes across populations. The findings suggest that Neanderthal numbers may have fallen to exceptionally low levels during that period. Population size later recovered, at least in absolute terms. Genetic diversity did not recover as easily. Variation lost during a bottleneck cannot be recreated quickly. Each subsequent contraction removed additional genetic possibilities from the population. Climatic fluctuations repeatedly reduced numbers, and every reduction narrowed the genetic toolkit available for future generations. One area affected by this process was the major histocompatibility complex, often shortened to the MHC. These genes play a central role in immune function by helping the body recognize and respond to pathogens. High diversity within the complex allows recognition of a wider range of biological threats. Reduced diversity limits those options. Professor Martin Sikora and his colleagues observed this pattern repeatedly across Neanderthal genomes. Their findings indicate that low genetic diversity was not confined to the final chapters of Neanderthal history. It appears throughout much of the lineage's existence, suggesting that demographic isolation remained a persistent feature of their world. By roughly 50,000 years ago, the consequences of that isolation had accumulated across hundreds of millennia. The genome carried the imprint of repeated bottlenecks, fragmented populations, and restricted gene flow. For generations, those costs remained manageable, absorbed by communities adapted to the conditions around them. Biological debts can remain dormant for long periods. They accumulate without demanding immediate payment. Then circumstances change, and vulnerabilities that once seemed survivable acquire a very different weight. Imagine a lifetime spent in a world where the climate itself could change character within a few generations. Forests shifted their boundaries. Grasslands expanded across regions once covered by trees. Rivers altered their courses. Animal migrations redrew the map of survival again and again. This was the Pleistocene, the only world Neanderthals ever knew. Modern civilization developed during a comparatively stable climatic interval. Neanderthals experienced something very different. Their entire history unfolded during one of the most volatile environmental periods of recent Earth history. Across hundreds of thousands of years, ice sheets repeatedly advanced and retreated across northern latitudes, transforming ecosystems on a continental scale. Among the most dramatic examples were the Dansgaard-Oeschger events, identified through Greenland ice cores. These climatic oscillations could produce temperature shifts of up to 15 degrees Celsius within mere decades. Such changes occurred far faster than the gradual transitions often imagined when discussing ancient climates. A child born into one ecological setting could reach adulthood in another. During colder stadial phases, immense ice sheets spread across northern Europe. Habitats contracted, productive landscapes became fragmented. The mammoth steppe, supporting herds of grazing animals, narrowed in extent. Forested river systems retreated into limited refuges farther south. Human populations followed the opportunities that remained. Warmer interstadial intervals brought a different arrangement of life. Glaciers withdrew. Vegetation expanded into newly available territory. Animal populations shifted northward in response, and Neanderthal groups moved alongside them. Archaeological evidence suggests repeated cycles of contraction and expansion, mirroring the changing geography around them. Genetic research has uncovered traces of these rhythms. Population reductions appear during severe cold periods, followed by phases of partial recovery when conditions improved. Each recovery restored numbers to some degree, though the process rarely replaced all the genetic variation lost during the preceding contraction. The pattern resembles a lineage repeatedly weathering storms while gradually surrendering pieces of its biological diversity. What makes this history striking is its duration. One climatic crisis might challenge a population. Neanderthals endured many. 10 major glacial cycles unfolded during their existence. Across those cycles, they encountered conditions capable of reshaping entire ecosystems. Temperatures reached levels that would devastate modern agricultural societies. The pressure came not once, but repeatedly across hundreds of millennia. Their environment included formidable competitors as well. Cave lions hunted the same herbivores. Cave bears occupied shelters that humans also sought. Woolly rhinoceroses and other large animals demanded caution whenever encountered. Survival required navigating a landscape where resources, weather, and dangerous fauna constantly interacted. The body described earlier was forged within this context. Broad chests supported high oxygen demands in cold environments. Enlarged nasal passages conditioned frigid air before it reached the lungs. Compact proportions helped conserve heat. High body mass provided energetic advantages during harsh winters. These traits emerged through long periods of natural selection, acting on populations repeatedly tested by climatic extremes. The important point is not that Neanderthals survived difficult conditions. Many species survive difficult conditions. The remarkable detail is that they survived these particular conditions for approximately 300,000 years. They adapted, contracted, recovered, migrated, and persisted through environmental instability that never truly ended. When viewed against that backdrop, their disappearance acquires a different scale. The lineage that weathered repeated glacial advances, abrupt temperature swings, shifting ecosystems, and relentless environmental uncertainty was the same lineage present when a new factor entered Eurasia. Whatever followed encountered a species already proven capable of surviving almost everything the Pleistocene could produce. On a map of the world, the distance between Africa and Eurasia appears surprisingly small. A narrow bridge of habitable land connects the two continents, threading its way through what is now Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. This region, known as the Levant, served as one of the most consequential crossroads in human history. For hundreds of thousands of years, populations moving north or south passed through this corridor, carrying genes, technologies, and experiences between continents. Human movement through the Levant did not begin with the migration that would eventually reshape Eurasia. Earlier groups of Homo sapiens reached the region between roughly 120,000 and 130,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence suggests that some advanced beyond Africa and entered territories already occupied by Neanderthals. Their presence proved temporary. Climatic deterioration may have reduced habitable environments, or those populations may simply have remained too small to establish a lasting foothold. Whatever the reason, they disappeared from the record, leaving Neanderthal populations still firmly established across their range. A different movement emerged tens of thousands of years later. Beginning around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, modern humans expanded outward from Africa in a way that proved sustained and successful. This migration did not fade after a few generations. It continued, spreading populations across landscapes where earlier attempts had failed. Archaeological remains indicate that these newcomers carried behavioral patterns and technologies that made them distinct from previous waves. The Levant became the meeting ground. Here, two human lineages that had followed separate evolutionary paths for hundreds of thousands of years occupied overlapping landscapes. Rivers, hunting territories, caves, and seasonal resources drew them into proximity. The archaeological record increasingly suggests that contact involved more than distant observation. Evidence published in 2025 from Tinshemet Cave in Israel provides a particularly revealing glimpse into this relationship. Researchers identified similarities in burial practices, shared use of ochre, and overlapping technological traditions. Such patterns are difficult to explain through coincidence alone. They suggest communication, imitation, and cultural exchange occurring between populations that encountered one another repeatedly. Stone tools offer further clues. At several contact zone sites, layers contain a mixture of Neanderthal Mysterian techniques alongside innovations associated with Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens groups. The overlap resembles a conversation conducted through craftsmanship. Methods developed by one population appear beside methods characteristic of the other, indicating that ideas could move across biological boundaries. This interaction does not resemble a straightforward story of conquest. The archaeological evidence points toward a prolonged period of coexistence. Communities occupied neighboring regions, learned from one another, and adapted within a shared landscape. Knowledge traveled, materials traveled, human relationships likely traveled as well. A mathematical model published in Nature Communications during 2019 proposed an intriguing possibility regarding why this balance persisted for so long. According to the model, disease may have acted as an invisible stabilizing force. Each population carried pathogens shaped by its own evolutionary history. Exposure to unfamiliar diseases could impose severe demographic costs on groups lacking previous immunity. Under those conditions, expansion became difficult. Populations moving too deeply into unfamiliar territory faced biological challenges alongside environmental ones. The boundary between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens ranges may therefore have remained relatively stable for thousands of years, maintained by forces neither side could fully perceive. For a considerable span of time, the corridor held that balance. Two forms of humanity occupied neighboring worlds, connected by exchange, proximity, and shared landscapes. Eventually, the equilibrium that had persisted across generations began to shift, and the consequences spread far beyond the Levant itself. Every meeting between populations carries more than language, tools, and ideas. It also carries microscopic passengers moving from body to body, crossing boundaries that neither side can see. In the Levant, where Neanderthals and Homo sapiens shared landscapes for thousands of years, this biological exchange may have become one of the most consequential forces in human history. Researchers Charlotte Holdcroft and Simon Underdown of Cambridge University proposed a striking perspective on this encounter. Modern humans arriving from Africa brought with them an evolutionary history shaped by tropical environments. Those environments supported extraordinary biological diversity, including a wide range of pathogens that had interacted with human populations for immense stretches of time. Over hundreds of thousands of years, African populations developed partial resistance to many infectious organisms through repeated exposure. The pathogens remained present, but the immune system had already learned portions of their biological language. Diseases related to tuberculosis, typhoid, encephalitic infections, respiratory illnesses, and other pathogens circulated within populations that possessed at least some inherited defenses. For the people carrying them, these organisms were often manageable companions of daily life. Infection could still be dangerous, but the relationship between host and pathogen had been shaped through long periods of coevolution. The biological struggle remained ongoing, though it unfolded within a framework established across countless generations. Neanderthals occupied a different world. Their populations had remained isolated throughout Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. The pathogens circulating within those environments differed from those found in tropical Africa. Their immune systems evolved under different pressures, responding to a distinct ecological community of bacteria, viruses, and parasites. When populations with separate pathogen histories finally entered sustained contact, familiar microbes to one side may have appeared entirely unfamiliar to the other. Exposure to a novel infectious agent can create consequences far greater than exposure to one already embedded within a population's evolutionary past. History offers several examples of this process. Following European arrival in the Americas during the 15th and 16th centuries, indigenous populations encountered diseases for which they possessed little or no prior immunity. Mortality rose dramatically in many regions. Epidemics arrived repeatedly, often affecting communities still recovering from earlier outbreaks. Demographic decline followed with a speed that astonished contemporary observers. The Neanderthal situation was separated from that event by tens of thousands of years, yet the underlying biological principle remains relevant. Their reduced genetic diversity may have amplified vulnerability. Earlier sections traced the narrowing of variation within key immune genes, particularly those associated with the major histocompatibility complex. Fewer variants meant fewer biological tools available for recognizing and responding to unfamiliar pathogens. Mathematical models, developed by Stanford geneticist Noah Rosenberg, suggest that even a modest difference in disease burden can accumulate into substantial demographic consequences over long periods. The mechanism does not require catastrophic mortality. A slightly elevated death rate, repeated generation after generation, gradually shifts the balance between populations occupying the same region. Such a process would leave little dramatic evidence behind. There would be no battlefield, no single disaster layer preserved in sediments, no obvious marker visible in the archaeological record. People would continue hunting, making tools, raising children, and moving across familiar landscapes while demographic pressures accumulated beneath the surface. The disease hypothesis, therefore, requires no organized conflict. Shared water sources, overlapping hunting territories, butchered carcasses, and ordinary proximity provide ample opportunities for transmission. Archaeology confirms that both species occupied many of the same environments during extended periods of coexistence. Disease may have been one strand in a larger web of pressures. Its influence could persist year after year, operating continuously, while another force, equally persistent and perhaps even more consequential, unfolded alongside it. An era can pass without monuments, kingdoms, or written records. It can unfold through campfires beside rivers, tracks crossing fresh snow, and generations born into landscapes already shared with another human species. The latest genetic evidence suggests that this was the reality of Europe during the final chapter of Neanderthal history. In December of 2024, analysis of 58 ancient Eurasian genomes produced the most refined estimate yet for the duration of coexistence between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. The overlap lasted approximately 6,000 to 7,000 years. Measured against a human lifetime, the span feels immense. Measured against prehistory, it remains substantial. The interval exceeds the entire time separating the construction of the Egyptian pyramids from the present day. Across those millennia, neither species occupied a neatly separated world. Their ranges overlapped across portions of Europe and Western Asia. Valleys, forests, migration routes, and hunting grounds sometimes carried traces of both populations. Archaeological layers from several regions preserve evidence of repeated presence within the same landscapes, suggesting encounters that were likely familiar rather than exceptional. Research, published during 2024, added another piece to this picture. Excavations in northern Europe confirmed that both species occupied the same region around 45,000 years ago. Fires burned in nearby camps. Stone tools were shaped from local materials. Herds moved through river corridors that each population understood well. The distance separating one group from the other may occasionally have been measured in days, perhaps even hours. Material culture hints at interactions extending beyond simple observation. The Châtel-Perronian tradition of France and Spain remains one of the most intriguing examples. Associated with late Neanderthal populations, it includes technological elements often linked with Homo sapiens communities. Stone blades became more refined, personal ornaments appeared. Certain manufacturing methods show similarities that many researchers interpret as evidence of learning, imitation, or direct cultural exchange. No archaeological layer preserves conversations, yet the artifacts suggest information moved across boundaries. Knowledge can travel without migration. A technique observed by one group may be repeated by another. A successful tool design may spread through neighboring populations. The frontier between these species appears less rigid than earlier generations of researchers imagined. While cultural interaction unfolded, demographic trajectories seem to have diverged. Evidence indicates that Homo sapiens populations expanded across Eurasia during this period. Neanderthal populations, already constrained by low numbers and limited genetic diversity, appear to have remained stable at best and possibly declined gradually in some regions. Population mathematics exerts influence with extraordinary patience. A modest advantage sustained across many generations produces outcomes that seem disproportionate to the initial difference. Slightly higher birth rates, somewhat greater survival among children, or more consistent access to food during difficult years can accumulate into substantial demographic change. Models exploring these dynamics show that even a small annual advantage, perhaps 1 or 2%, becomes powerful when compounded over 6,000 to 7,000 years. No battlefield is required. No coordinated campaign is necessary. The process unfolds through ordinary lives repeated across countless seasons. Children reach adulthood. Families expand. Settlements persist. Another population grows a little more slowly. Generation follows generation until the balance shifts beyond recovery. Throughout these same millennia, another process unfolded alongside coexistence, exchange, and demographic change. Its evidence survives today within the genomes of living people, adding a complication that transforms the extinction story into something far more intricate than simple replacement. The story took an unexpected turn inside a laboratory rather than a cave. Fragments of bone recovered from Vindija Cave in Croatia carried traces of genetic information so fragile that many researchers once doubted it could ever be reconstructed. Then, in 2010, the first draft Neanderthal genome emerged. Within its sequence lay evidence that transformed the relationship between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens from speculation into biological fact. The result was striking. These two human lineages had not merely encountered one another across Ice Age Eurasia, they had produced children together. A debate that had persisted for generations was settled by molecules preserved for tens of thousands of years inside fossilized remains. The picture became sharper in December of 2024. Two independent studies, published in Nature and Science, examined ancient genomes with a level of precision unavailable only a few years earlier. Their findings narrowed the period of interbreeding to a window beginning around 50,500 years ago and continuing for roughly 7,000 years. The timing mirrors the archaeological record, where evidence places both populations within the same landscapes across multiple millennia. Such a span cannot be explained by isolated encounters. 7,000 years represents hundreds of generations. Across that duration, contact occurred often enough to leave a lasting imprint in the DNA of billions of people alive today. Human history rarely preserves direct records from this period, yet genetics provides a ledger written inside living cells. That ledger shows a clear pattern. People whose ancestry lies outside Africa carry approximately 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Early Homo sapiens, living around 40,000 years ago, possessed even more, in some cases between 6 and 9%. Across thousands of generations, recombination gradually diluted those inherited fragments, scattering them through the human genome like pieces of a much older manuscript. This discovery complicates the idea of extinction. If Neanderthal genes remain present in modern populations, then part of their biological legacy endured. Their disappearance cannot be described as complete erasure. Elements of their evolutionary history continued forward inside another lineage. At the same time, the genetic record reveals an important asymmetry. Nuclear DNA, inherited from both parents, clearly shows Neanderthal contributions. Mitochondrial DNA tells a different story. Passed through maternal lines, it is absent from every living human population studied so far. No confirmed Neanderthal mitochondrial lineage survives today. Researchers view this pattern as evidence that some hybrid combinations were less successful than others. Offspring born to Neanderthal mothers and sapiens fathers may have experienced reduced survival or lower reproductive success. The exact mechanism remains uncertain, though the signal appears consistently across modern genomes. Somewhere within the process of interbreeding, a partial biological barrier still existed. Gene flow also appears to have moved primarily in one direction. Modern human populations absorbed Neanderthal genetic material. Neanderthal populations, by contrast, show little evidence of large-scale incorporation of sapiens ancestry. Through their final millennia, they remained overwhelmingly Neanderthal in genetic identity even as contact continued around them. The consequence is both subtle and profound. Extinction and survival occupy the same narrative. A people vanished from the fossil record while portions of their biology entered the future. Bones disappeared, communities ended, and a fraction of their inheritance crossed into another human story. From this point onward, attention shifts from whether Neanderthal genes survived to what those surviving fragments actually do, and what may have been lost with the fragments that never reached the present. Chemistry remembers meals long after flesh has vanished. Locked inside Neanderthal bones, tiny differences in nitrogen isotopes preserve a record of what entered their bodies across a lifetime. When researchers examined those chemical signatures, a consistent pattern emerged from sites scattered across Europe and Western Asia. Neanderthals occupied one of the highest positions in their ecosystem's food web. Their primary prey included mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, bison, horse, and reindeer. These were large herbivores, capable of providing enormous amounts of energy from a successful hunt. The isotope values found in Neanderthal remains often resemble those of top carnivores, placing them among the dominant predators of the Ice Age landscape. Such a strategy worked exceptionally well under the conditions in which it evolved. Cold grasslands stretched across large portions of Eurasia. Herds migrated through predictable territories. Generations accumulated knowledge of seasonal movements, hunting locations, and the behavior of prey species that had shaped their lives for hundreds of thousands of years. Every part of that system depended on stability. Mammoths required grasslands. Grasslands depended on climatic conditions capable of sustaining them. Large herbivore populations needed enough vegetation to support enormous bodies across enormous distances. A disruption at any level could travel upward through the entire chain. Climate fluctuations altered habitats. Disease affected animal populations. Competition increased pressure on shared resources. Each change reduced reliability in a food network that drew much of its strength from a relatively small number of large prey species. For hunters positioned near the top of that structure, the consequences could be substantial. Archaeological evidence from Homo sapiens sites of the same period reveals a different pattern. Alongside the remains of large mammals appear fish bones, bird bones, freshwater shellfish, rabbits, and traces of plant foods. Charred seeds and botanical remains indicate the use of a broader range of edible resources. No single food source carried the entire burden of survival. This diversity created flexibility. If one resource became scarce, others remained available. Rivers offered fish, wetlands provided waterfowl, coastal environments supplied shellfish. Small mammals could be trapped or hunted with comparatively lower risk. The nutritional return from each individual resource may have been smaller, yet the overall system possessed multiple pathways through difficulty. Fishing illustrates the contrast particularly well. Evidence for regular exploitation of aquatic foods appears repeatedly at Upper Paleolithic sapiens sites. Fish represent a dense source of calories and nutrients, especially during periods when terrestrial hunting becomes less predictable. Across much of Neanderthal archaeology, comparable evidence remains limited. Food was also connected to movement. Materials such as obsidian, ochre, and marine shells traveled hundreds of kilometers across sapiens exchange networks. These objects reveal relationships linking distant groups. Resources, information, and assistance could move along the same routes. Neanderthal communities generally acquired stone and other materials from nearby sources. Many sites show procurement ranges measured in tens rather than hundreds of kilometers. The pattern reflects a world rooted in local landscapes, where survival depended heavily on what the surrounding territory could provide. For 300,000 years, this approach succeeded. It delivered abundant calories and supported one of the most physically capable human populations ever to exist. As environments became less predictable and competition intensified, the strengths of that system began to reveal its limits. A strategy built around efficiency possessed very little redundancy when the world stopped behaving as expected. Picture two groups facing the same difficult winter. Each possesses skilled hunters, knowledge of animal movements, and generations of experience within their environment. At first glance, the difference between them appears small. One consists of a single band bound closely to a familiar landscape. The other belongs to a much larger web of communities extending far beyond the horizon. The contrast becomes clearer when viewed through the movement of information. A Neanderthal band of roughly 20 individuals may have understood every valley, cliff, migration route, and shelter within its territory. Such expertise carried enormous value. In that specific region, they could have outperformed newcomers lacking local knowledge. Their survival depended on intimate familiarity with place, accumulated through lifetimes spent navigating the same terrain. Homo sapiens possessed local knowledge as well, Yet archaeological evidence suggests they also maintained broader social connections linking distant groups. A hunting technique discovered in one community could spread outward through exchange relationships. Knowledge traveled with visiting relatives, trade partners, and individuals moving between groups. An innovation developed hundreds of kilometers away had a pathway through which it could reach people who had never met its original creator. This difference matters because information behaves much like a resource. It accumulates, spreads, and survives when supported by enough connections. Within a large network, useful ideas can persist even if the group that first created them disappears. Within a small, isolated band, knowledge remains vulnerable to the fate of the individuals carrying it. The same principle applies to genetics. Earlier evidence revealed the demographic challenges facing Neanderthal populations. Small communities separated by large distances exchanged mates less frequently than populations linked through broader social systems. Every connection between groups introduces genetic variation. Every exchange helps reduce the accumulation of harmful inherited traits. Networks act as biological bridges as much as social ones. Material remains offer glimpses of these connections. Upper Paleolithic sites associated with Homo sapiens contain marine shells discovered far inland, perforated animal teeth carried far from their source, and pigments transported across considerable distances. These objects moved through chains of human relationships, stretching across landscapes far larger than any single group's territory. Neanderthal ornamental objects exist as well, demonstrating symbolic behavior and aesthetic interests already explored earlier. Their distribution, however, tends to be more local. Materials often originate from nearby sources, suggesting exchange networks that operated across shorter geographic ranges. Some researchers have proposed that differences in brain organization may have contributed to this divergence. Comparative studies indicate that Homo sapiens possessed a somewhat larger cerebellum relative to overall brain size. Beyond coordinating movement, this region participates in learning, language processing, and aspects of social cognition. Any advantage was likely modest, yet even a slight improvement in maintaining complex social relationships could become significant when compounded across many generations. The practical consequences emerged most clearly during hardship. A struggling sapiens community was not necessarily limited to the resources immediately around it. Assistance could arrive through established relationships. Information about food sources, migration routes, or favorable territories could travel across connected populations. An isolated Neanderthal band facing the same challenge depended primarily on its own members and its own landscape. Strength, skill, and experience remained formidable assets, though connections increasingly determined resilience. As pressures accumulated across Eurasia, another force entered the story. It arrived from deep beneath southern Italy and carried consequences measured across continents. Across the archaeological record, certain layers stand apart from everything above and below them. They arrive as thin bands of ash scattered across continents, preserving the memory of a single event. One such layer appears throughout Europe and Western Asia, marking a day when forces rising from deep within the earth altered conditions across an already strained world. Approximately 39,300 years ago, during the period when Neanderthal populations were shrinking across much of their range, the volcanic system known today as the Phlegrean Fields erupted west of present-day Naples. Geologists call the event the Campanian Ignimbrite eruption. In scale, it exceeds anything witnessed during recorded human history. The eruption column pierced high into the atmosphere, carrying ash and gases far beyond the Italian peninsula. Its most significant contribution was not molten rock, it was sulfur dioxide. Estimates suggest that between 50 and 200 teragrams of sulfur dioxide entered the stratosphere. There, chemical reactions transformed the gas into reflective aerosol particles suspended high above weather systems. These particles scattered incoming sunlight back into space. The effect was not confined to a local region. It influenced climate across much of the northern hemisphere. Evidence of the eruption appears in sediments spread over more than 3 million square kilometers. Traces have been identified from Italy through the Balkans, across the eastern Mediterranean, and into the plains of Eastern Europe. Archaeologists working at sites separated by thousands of kilometers can identify the same volcanic horizon, creating a shared timestamp embedded in the landscape. For populations already living near ecological limits, the consequences extended far beyond falling ash. Climate models indicate that parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia may have experienced temperature declines between 6 and 9 degrees Celsius during the period of strongest impact. Such numbers can appear modest when written on a page. Within a glacial world, they represented profound environmental disruption. Growing seasons shortened, plant communities shifted, habitats supporting grazing animals contracted or fragmented. The effects moved through food webs in sequence. Vegetation changed first. Herbivores responded to those changes through migration, decline, or local disappearance. Predators followed the fate of their prey. Every stage carried delays and regional variation, though the overall pressure pointed in the same direction. By itself, a volcanic winter does not automatically explain extinction. Neanderthals had endured climatic upheavals many times before. Earlier sections trace their passage through repeated glacial cycles, abrupt temperature oscillations, and ecological transformations that would have challenged any large mammal population. Their history demonstrates resilience on an extraordinary scale. What makes the Campanian Ignimbrite event significant is its timing. It struck during an era when multiple pressures were already converging. Populations remained sparse across immense territories. Genetic diversity had been reduced by recurring bottlenecks. Contact with expanding Homo sapiens, populations introduced new demographic realities. Resource competition operated across many regions at once. Disease exposure may have imposed additional burdens that accumulated generation after generation. The eruption entered this landscape like another weight placed onto a structure already carrying many others. No single beam necessarily failed at once. Every added strain reduced the margin for recovery. For communities living close to demographic limits, survival often depends less on average years than on the rare moments when several hardships arrive together. The Campanian Ignimbrite eruption belongs to that category, an environmental shock delivered at a point when resilience may already have been wearing thin. Its place in the story remains crucial, though whether it served as the final blow requires a closer look. At first glance, the timeline appears almost too neat. A colossal eruption shakes Europe. Temperatures fall. Neanderthals vanish. The sequence seems to invite a straightforward conclusion. For many years, that possibility attracted serious attention. A disaster of such magnitude appears, capable of explaining an extinction on its own. As more evidence accumulated, however, the picture became less direct and far more revealing. Computer simulations conducted by geoscientist Benjamin Black and colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley, examined the climatic effects of the Campanian Ignimbrite eruption in detail. Their findings suggested that the strongest cooling persisted for roughly 1 to 2 years. The environmental consequences were substantial, though they did not unfold evenly across the continent. Eastern Europe and parts of Central Asia experienced the most severe impacts. Western Europe, where many Neanderthal populations remained concentrated during their final millennia, appears to have been affected less dramatically than earlier assumptions proposed. This distinction matters because extinction is rarely explained by magnitude alone. Geography shapes outcomes. A severe disturbance can devastate one region while leaving another comparatively buffered. The volcanic ash layer forms a shared horizon across enormous distances, though the lived experience beneath that horizon varied from place to place. Radiocarbon evidence adds another layer to the story. By the time the eruption occurred, modern humans had already established themselves in parts of Europe. Archaeological records show that Neanderthal territory had been contracting for thousands of years. Population densities were decreasing. Genetic diversity had already been reduced through repeated bottlenecks. Contact with expanding Homo sapiens populations was no longer a future event. It was an ongoing reality. In that context, the eruption did not begin the decline. It arrived during a decline that was already unfolding. An even more surprising possibility emerges from climate modeling focused on the Iberian Peninsula. Some researchers have suggested that southwestern Europe may have experienced comparatively moderate effects from the eruption. This region also happens to contain several of the latest confirmed Neanderthal occupations known to science. If cooling temporarily slowed the expansion of modern human groups into those landscapes, the eruption may have granted isolated Neanderthal communities a brief extension of survival. A catastrophe at continental scale may, in certain local circumstances, have delayed disappearance rather than accelerated it. Such findings move the discussion away from dramatic, single-cause explanations. The evidence increasingly points toward cumulative pressures acting together across many generations. Disease exposure, shrinking population size, genetic erosion, ecological competition, dietary vulnerability, and fragmented social networks were already shaping the trajectory of the species. Each challenge reduced flexibility, each setback narrowed future options. What the eruption appears to have removed was resilience itself. Large populations possess demographic depth. Losses can be absorbed and replenished. Genetic diversity provides biological flexibility. Broad social networks distribute risk across landscapes. A harsh year becomes survivable because recovery mechanisms already exist. The remaining Neanderthal communities possessed far less of that protection. Their numbers were smaller, their connections were thinner, their margin for error had been steadily shrinking across millennia. Viewed through that lens, the Campanian ignimbrite was neither executioner nor sole architect of extinction. It functioned as the final condition added to a system already under strain. The equation had been accumulating terms for thousands of years. The eruption altered the balance once more, pressing upon populations that had fewer and fewer ways to respond. Across the western edges of Eurasia, the last Neanderthal communities continued on, scattered through landscapes that had become increasingly fragmented, carrying the long history of their lineage into its final chapters. Maps of extinction often create the illusion of a sudden disappearance. A color fades from a region, a date is assigned, and a species seems to vanish in a moment. The archaeological record tells a different story for Neanderthals. Their final chapter unfolded gradually, measured in generations, campsites, and territories surrendered one landscape at a time. The pattern emerges from thousands of stone tools, hearths, animal bones, and occupation layers scattered across Eurasia. Earlier in their history, Neanderthals occupied an immense range stretching across much of Europe and deep into Western Asia. During the closing phase of their existence, that range began to contract. The process did not occur everywhere at once. It moved across the continent in a recognizable direction. Northern and Central European sites are among the first to drop from the archaeological record. Occupations that had persisted for millennia disappear from the record. The sequence aligns broadly with the spread of modern human populations moving through the same regions. Archaeologists do not see evidence of a single catastrophic replacement. Instead, site after site ceases to show signs of continued Neanderthal presence. As centuries passed, the contraction became increasingly apparent. By roughly 43,000 to 42,000 years ago, many Central European localities no longer preserve evidence of Neanderthal occupation. A few thousand years later, sites in France became rarer. The geographical center of survival drifted steadily toward Europe's southwestern margins. This movement carried surviving communities into regions offering natural protection. Among the most important was the Iberian Peninsula, encompassing present-day Spain and Portugal. Geography granted advantages that much of the continent lacked. The Pyrenees formed a substantial barrier separating Iberia from the rest of Western Europe. Climate conditions were generally milder than those farther north. River systems, coastal environments, and ecological diversity provided resources that remained available even as conditions fluctuated elsewhere. Such landscapes became refugia, places where populations could persist after disappearing from surrounding regions. Evidence from these final territories reveals something striking. Neanderthal life continued. Tools were still manufactured using familiar techniques. Fires were maintained. Animals were hunted and processed. Daily activities left traces in caves and open-air sites, much as they had for countless generations before. The archaeological signature does not suggest panic or societal collapse. It suggests continuity within narrowing boundaries. Among the most famous locations is Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, situated near the southern tip of Europe where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic. The site preserves some of the latest confirmed evidence associated with Neanderthals. One engraved panel, consisting of intersecting lines carved into bedrock, stands among the final known expressions of their symbolic behavior. A hand moved across that surface, producing a pattern that endured long after the maker vanished. The retreat carried a hidden consequence. Every reduction in territory increased isolation. Populations became smaller and more fragmented. Connections between groups grew harder to maintain. The same mountains, coastlines, and geographic barriers that protected surviving communities also separated them from one another. Genetic exchange became less frequent. Demographic resilience weakened further. What remained were pockets of people occupying the edges of a continent. Their world had not disappeared all at once. It had narrowed step by step, generation by generation, until only scattered communities remained. Within those final enclaves, life continued, though the conditions surrounding it had changed profoundly. The crucial question is not where these last Neanderthals lived. It is what daily existence felt like within populations that had become so small, so isolated, and so distant from the immense range their ancestors once occupied. Imagine a community so small that every face is familiar from birth, every absence immediately noticed, every new child carrying significance far beyond a single family. By approximately 40,000 years ago, Many of the remaining Neanderthal groups in southern Iberia may have existed in circumstances much like this. Their world had contracted to scattered refuges along Europe's southwestern margins, where survival continued in pockets separated by mountains, distance, and time. The archaeological record suggests populations measured in dozens rather than hundreds. Some groups may have numbered fewer than 20 individuals. Genetic studies indicate that the effective breeding population across these surviving regions was likely among the smallest in Neanderthal history. Entire lineages depended upon a handful of adults producing healthy offspring under increasingly difficult conditions. Despite these pressures, daily life retained a sense of continuity, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Stone tools recovered from late Iberian sites belong overwhelmingly to the Mousterian tradition. Flakes, scrapers, and points were fashioned using methods inherited across countless generations. The technology remained functional and familiar. Nothing in the evidence suggests a burst of radical innovation intended to reverse their demographic decline. Around hearths, routines continued much as they always had. Charcoal fragments and burned animal bones testify to controlled fire use in these final occupations. Flames still provided warmth, light, protection, and a place around which social life gathered. Meals were prepared, tools were maintained. Stories, whatever form they took, likely passed between individuals whose ancestors had shared similar gatherings across immense spans of time. One of the most evocative traces comes from Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar. Carved into bedrock is a deeply incised crosshatch design produced through repeated deliberate strokes. The pattern required effort and intention. Its purpose remains unknown. No surviving tradition explains it. No living descendant can interpret its meaning. Even so, the engraving stands as evidence that symbolic behavior endured until very late in Neanderthal history. A mind looked at stone and chose to leave a mark that served some purpose beyond immediate survival. The surrounding landscape differed from the one occupied by many earlier Neanderthal populations. During this period, sea levels were lower. Beyond the cave stretched a coastal plain, now submerged beneath Mediterranean waters. Archaeological evidence suggests these communities increasingly exploited marine resources, gathering shellfish, collecting coastal foods, and taking advantage of seabirds and shoreline habitats. Such flexibility may reflect adaptation to changing conditions inland, where large herbivore populations had become less predictable. Beneath these visible behaviors lay a more troubling biological reality. Generations of isolation had narrowed genetic diversity. Harmful recessive mutations likely appeared with greater frequency. Immune systems carried fewer variations capable of recognizing unfamiliar pathogens. Each birth occurred within a population carrying the accumulated consequences of demographic contraction. Contact with modern humans may still have occurred along the northern approaches to Iberia. The long period of coexistence had only recently ended, or was perhaps ending within the lifetimes of these communities. Somewhere beyond the horizon, other human groups expanded through networks far larger than anything the remaining Neanderthals possessed. What these final communities lacked was not intelligence, determination, or knowledge of their homeland. They lacked reinforcements. They lacked fresh genetic diversity. They lacked any path back toward the immense range their ancestors once occupied. Most striking of all, they had no reason to understand that their story was approaching its conclusion. Fires still burned, tools were still shaped, marks were still carved into stone. Life continued, even as the number of places where that life endured grew smaller with each passing generation. Extinction often arrives in the imagination as a moment, a final catastrophe compressed into a single scene. The fossil record tells a different story. It describes a process governed by arithmetic, probabilities, and the unforgiving behavior of small populations. By the closing chapters of Neanderthal history, many of the forces shaping their future had become measurable long before the final individuals disappeared. Conservation biologists use a concept known as the minimum viable population, the point below which a species loses the capacity to sustain itself across long spans of time. The exact number varies according to biology and environment, yet the principle remains consistent. Once a population shrinks beyond a critical threshold, births can no longer reliably compensate for deaths. Chance events begin to outweigh resilience. For Neanderthals, this threshold carried unusual weight. Their lives unfolded at a human pace. Childhood lasted many years. Mothers generally produced one infant at a time. Hunting large animals involved injury risks that followed individuals throughout adulthood. Recovery from demographic losses, therefore, moved gradually, even under favorable circumstances. Genetic evidence from late Neanderthal populations suggests that the effective number of breeding females across Europe may have hovered around 1,500 during their final period. Such figures represent more than a census. They reflect the portion of a population actually transmitting genes into the future. Once those numbers fall sufficiently low, every death acquires greater significance. Every failed pregnancy matters. Every season of scarcity leaves a mark. The pressures described across previous generations converged upon the same narrowing path: reduced genetic diversity, weakened adaptability, isolated communities exchanged fewer mates, resource competition strained populations already living close to demographic limits. Environmental disruptions imposed additional losses upon groups with little capacity to absorb them. Mathematically, decline behaves differently from growth. Expanding populations create larger pools of potential parents, larger reserves of knowledge, and broader opportunities for recovery after hardship. Contracting populations experience the reverse. Smaller numbers produce fewer births. Fewer births accelerate contraction. The cycle feeds upon itself. A difficult feature of this process is that it can continue even when daily life appears normal. Fires are still maintained, tools are still shaped, children are still born. Nothing in a single season necessarily reveals the direction of the larger curve. Across generations, however, the pattern becomes increasingly difficult to escape. Population models demonstrate that once a species with long generation times enters this state, recovery generally requires an external source of genetic and demographic reinforcement. For Neanderthals, the only substantial human population beyond their shrinking range was Homo sapiens. The world outside their remaining refuges no longer contained large neighboring Neanderthal communities capable of reversing the trend. At some point, a final hearth burned within a surviving settlement. Somewhere, the last child, carrying a fully Neanderthal lineage, entered the world. Years later, the last individual belonging entirely to that lineage died in the ordinary manner shared by all living creatures. No geological marker records that moment. No witness preserved its date. What remains is the pattern left behind. Layer by layer, site by site, the fossil record follows the contraction until the traces cease. The silence in the evidence is itself part of the story. A response written not in words, but in absence, where a population once persisted and then no longer did. A disappearance measured across thousands of years leaves behind a different kind of evidence than a catastrophe. It does not carve a sharp line through the ground. It does not scatter bodies across a landscape. Instead, it reveals itself through patterns of diminishing presence, through traces that become rarer until they cease altogether. The final chapter of the Neanderthals survives in exactly this form. The youngest confirmed Neanderthal fossils currently date to approximately 39,000 years ago. Even that statement carries layers of caution. Dating remains from this period is difficult because radiocarbon methods approach the limits of their precision. Tiny contaminations can shift results. Geological processes can disturb sediments. Every proposed date must survive extensive scrutiny before entering the scientific consensus. For that reason, the word confirmed carries unusual weight. A confirmed Neanderthal fossil is not merely a bone found in a cave, it is a specimen directly dated, whenever possible, examined repeatedly by specialists, identified through anatomical characteristics accepted by multiple researchers, and recovered from a stratigraphic context whose history is understood with confidence. The standard is demanding because the question matters. A handful of sites in Iberia have produced dates suggesting Neanderthal survival beyond 39,000 years ago. Some estimates extend toward 37,000 or even 35,000 years before the present. Debate surrounding these sites continues because dating methods, sediment movement, and site formation processes remain subjects of investigation. At present, the broader consensus still places the final confirmed record near 39,000 years ago. Viewed from the perspective of archaeology, the ending unfolds through subtraction. Occupied shelters cease, showing evidence of occupation. Stone tools associated with long established traditions stop appearing in younger layers. Hearths leave charcoal in one horizon and none in the next. The sequence repeats across region after region. Nothing in this pattern resembles a final battlefield. Excavations have uncovered no continent-wide layer of destruction. There is no concentration of skeletons indicating a last stand. No geological horizon marks a sudden continent-scale mortality event. The evidence accumulated across decades of research points toward attrition, fragmentation, and gradual disappearance rather than a single terminal moment. This absence becomes more striking when considered against the scale of Neanderthal history. For roughly 300,000 years, they occupied an enormous territory stretching across Europe and Western Asia, an area approaching 26 million square kilometers. They left stone tools, hearths, butchered animal bones, shelters, pigments, ornaments, engravings, and their own remains, generation after generation added to that record. Then the record ends. Layer above, layer contains evidence of other humans, other technologies, and other populations. The distinctive signatures associated with Neanderthals no longer appear. The continuity breaks and never resumes. Across thousands of excavated sites, researchers have searched for the return of that pattern and have not found it. The final individual, belonging entirely to the Neanderthal lineage, left no account of their passing. No witness preserved the event. No marker identifies the day. The fossil record offers only the same answer it has offered throughout this story. Traces, gaps, and probabilities assembled from stone and bone. From those fragments emerges a picture of presence, followed by permanence of absence, a verdict written not in a dramatic ending, but in the fact that the evidence stops. A forensic investigation reaches its most revealing stage when every simple explanation has failed. Piece by piece, evidence is gathered, tested, challenged, and compared against reality. The story of the Neanderthals has passed through that process for decades. Each new fossil, each genome, each climate reconstruction, and each archaeological discovery has narrowed the possibilities. What remains is more complex than any single cause. Climate was once considered the leading suspect. The reasoning seemed straightforward. Their disappearance occurred during a period of environmental instability, and climate has ended many ecological stories throughout Earth's history. Detailed reconstructions, however, revealed a complication. Neanderthals had already endured repeated climatic upheavals across hundreds of thousands of years. Glacial advances, warming intervals, shifting vegetation zones, and dramatic environmental transitions had all come and gone while the species persisted. Climate clearly exerted pressure, yet the evidence no longer supports it as the sole driver of the final decline. Competition offers another part of the puzzle. Modern humans expanded across landscapes that Neanderthals had occupied for immense stretches of time. Resources overlapped, hunting territories overlapped, settlement regions overlapped. Still, the archaeological record documents approximately 6,000 to 7,000 years of coexistence. Such duration argues against a rapid displacement driven by direct competition alone. The process unfolded across many generations, indicating additional forces were operating alongside it. Disease contributes another layer. Populations separated for long periods develop different relationships with pathogens. Contact between such populations can create unequal biological consequences. Mathematical models suggest that even modest differences in mortality, sustained across centuries, can gradually reshape demographic outcomes. Yet, disease by itself struggles to explain the full pattern observed across multiple regions and environments. Its effects appear significant, though incomplete, when viewed in isolation. The Campanian ignimbrite eruption also attracted attention because of its dramatic timing. Geological evidence records one of the largest volcanic events in European prehistory, occurring during the closing stages of Neanderthal existence. Subsequent climate modeling produced a more nuanced picture. Cooling associated with the eruption was substantial but relatively short lived, and the areas experiencing the strongest effects did not perfectly align with the principal Western European refuges. The eruption mattered, though it does not stand as a complete explanation. Interbreeding, likewise, fails to resolve the mystery by itself. Genetic research established beyond doubt that Neanderthals contributed DNA to later human populations. Fragments of their biological inheritance remain present today. At the same time, the absence of Neanderthal mitochondrial lineages in living humans demonstrates that complete absorption never occurred. Part of their legacy survived, while the distinct population itself disappeared. As these individual explanations weakened under scrutiny, a broader pattern emerged. Long-standing genetic vulnerability reduced resilience. Pathogen exposure introduced additional demographic costs. Flexible resource strategies favored expanding modern human populations. Social networks extended the reach of information and support. Volcanic disruption arrived during a period when recovery margins had already narrowed. Ecologists describe such situations as regime shifts. A system may withstand one stress, then another, and still remain functional. Eventually, multiple pressures intersect. Recovery becomes progressively less likely until stability gives way to decline. The forensic verdict assembled from modern evidence points toward convergence. No single force ended the Neanderthals. A series of pressures accumulated upon a population with little room left for error. They were not overcome by one decisive blow. They were overtaken by many forces arriving together, each adding weight until the balance could no longer hold. The disappearance of a species usually marks the end of its biological story. Neanderthals occupy a rarer category. Their populations vanished, their territories passed into the hands of others, and their distinct lineage came to an end. Yet fragments of them remain active inside millions of living people, continuing to influence bodies that exist tens of thousands of years after the last Neanderthal walked the landscapes of Eurasia. Genetic research has revealed that the surviving Neanderthal contribution to modern humans was not distributed randomly across the genome. Natural selection acted upon those inherited fragments generation after generation. Variants that provided useful advantages tended to persist. Variants carrying costs were more likely to disappear. The result is a genetic inheritance shaped by thousands of years of biological filtering. One of the clearest patterns appears within regions associated with immune function. Among the most important are genes connected to the major histocompatibility complex, the molecular system responsible for helping the body recognize invading pathogens. When Homo sapiens expanded into Eurasia, they entered environments filled with microorganisms, parasites, and infectious diseases that Neanderthal populations had encountered for hundreds of thousands of years. In that context, interbreeding may have provided something extraordinarily valuable. Instead of waiting countless generations for new beneficial mutations to arise and spread, incoming human populations acquired genetic variants already tested by long exposure to Eurasian disease environments. Adaptations that had taken hundreds of millennia to evolve could move between populations through a single generation of shared ancestry. The exchange was not entirely beneficial. Evolution does not produce universally perfect solutions. Adaptations emerge within particular environments, and their value often changes when conditions change. A genetic variant that improves survival in one era can become problematic in another. This reality became especially visible during the coronavirus pandemic. Researchers identified a region on chromosome 19 inherited from Neanderthal ancestors that increased the risk of severe illness from severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus, to infection. A variant shaped within Ice Age ecosystems remained biologically active in the 21st century, interacting with a pathogen that neither Neanderthals nor early modern humans could ever have encountered. Other inherited variants have been associated with increased susceptibility to conditions including Crohn's disease, lupus, biliary cirrhosis, depression, and type 2 diabetes. These links do not mean Neanderthal genes directly cause such disorders. Human health arises from intricate interactions among many genes, environments, and life experiences. Nevertheless, they illustrate how adaptations beneficial under Pleistocene conditions can produce different outcomes in modern societies. Physical traits also carry traces of this inheritance. Certain skin and hair characteristics present within European populations appear connected to Neanderthal ancestry. Features that aided survival in regions with lower ultraviolet radiation retained relevance long after the environments that originally shaped them had changed. Viewed together, the surviving fragments form neither a heroic legacy nor a harmful burden. They represent a biological trade. Modern humans inherited useful defenses, physiological adjustments, and environmental adaptations. Alongside them came vulnerabilities whose consequences only emerged under circumstances vastly different from those of the Ice Age. The deeper significance lies in what this inheritance represents. Of all the countless features that once defined Neanderthals, Only a fraction traveled forward into living populations. Natural selection preserved some pieces and discarded others. Their bodies left traces that can still be measured today. Much harder to measure are the traits that vanished with them, the adaptations, perceptions, and possibilities that never crossed the genetic bridge into the future. A knowledge tradition leaves traces only while there are minds capable of carrying it forward. Once the final bearer disappears, the tradition vanishes as completely as smoke dissolving into air. This is the challenge faced when looking at Neanderthals. Archaeology can recover fragments of behavior, tools, bones, pigments, and hearths. It cannot recover the full contents of a mind, nor the countless lessons passed from one generation to the next across 300,000 years. The evidence that remains hints at a depth of understanding far greater than the sparse objects scattered through caves and sediments might suggest. Chemical residues trapped within dental calculus reveal the use of plants possessing documented medicinal properties. Yarrow, groundsel, ephedra, and several others appear repeatedly enough to attract scientific attention. Their presence suggests choices informed by experience accumulated across many lifetimes. A medicinal tradition does not emerge from a single discovery. It develops through observation, memory, trial, error, and transmission. Someone learns which plant eases pain. Another discovers that a different preparation changes the outcome. Knowledge spreads through families and communities. Most of that process leaves no durable archaeological signature. The surviving clues are therefore almost certainly smaller than the reality that produced them. Their technological abilities point toward a similar pattern. Neanderthals manufactured composite adhesives using combinations of ingredients that required careful control of temperature and timing. Birch tar production alone involves a sequence of actions that cannot be achieved through accident. Such procedures depend upon practical chemistry preserved through teaching. Each successful batch represented understanding carried from one pair of hands to another. The marks they left on cave surfaces deepen the mystery. Engravings found at sites such as Gorham's Cave display deliberate patterns created through repeated strokes. They required effort and intention. The physical marks survive. Their meaning does not. Whether they marked territory, commemorated events, expressed symbolic ideas, or served purposes entirely unfamiliar to modern thought, remains unknown. Other discoveries widen the gap between evidence and interpretation. Collections of black feathers from multiple bird species appear at several sites. The birds were not always selected for food value. Something about those feathers mattered. Ornamentation, ritual practice, social identity, storytelling, or beliefs may have been involved. Archaeology can identify the objects. The significance attached to them remains beyond recovery. This uncertainty extends beyond Neanderthals alone. Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo floresiensis, and other vanished human relatives each possessed their own accumulated experiences. Every lineage carried ways of understanding landscapes, animals, seasons, materials, and social life. When those populations disappeared, their intellectual worlds disappeared as well. The most difficult aspect of such loss is that its boundaries cannot be measured. A destroyed manuscript leaves missing pages. A vanished language leaves words that can no longer be translated. An extinct human lineage leaves no inventory of what it once knew. There is no record of forgotten medicines that worked, stories that guided communities, or concepts that never crossed into our ancestry. Seen from that perspective, the Neanderthal extinction represents more than a biological event. It marks the disappearance of an entire tradition of thought. 300,000 years of accumulated experience ceased without archive, successor, or preservation. It was a library burned before anyone understood that shelves had existed at all. A species can dominate a landscape for hundreds of thousands of years and still disappear without a dramatic final day. The fossil record shows this repeatedly. Extinction often arrives through accumulation, each pressure modest on its own, each challenge survivable in isolation, until together they reshape the future in ways no population can withstand. The Neanderthal story belongs to this broader pattern, one found throughout the history of life. Popular images of extinction tend to focus on catastrophe. A mountain explodes, a flood sweeps across a continent, a rock falls from space. Such events certainly occur, and some have altered the course of evolution. Many disappearances, however, unfold through a different process. A population loses flexibility, while the world around it becomes less predictable. The change may span centuries or millennia, unfolding at a pace invisible to the individuals living through it. By the final chapters of Neanderthal history, several pressures were operating at once. Their bodies had evolved for demanding northern environments. Strong muscles, broad frames, and substantial energy requirements had served them well through long periods of glacial Europe. Those same traits carried a metabolic cost. More calories were required each day, and calories became harder to secure when prey distributions shifted and competition increased across overlapping territories. Social organization followed a similar pattern. Small bands possessed detailed knowledge of local terrain, seasonal movement routes, shelter locations, and hunting opportunities. Such intimacy with a landscape could sustain communities for generations. Under conditions of fragmentation, the same structure created vulnerability. A local setback remained local. Losses could not easily be offset by distant allies because distant allies often did not exist. Food acquisition reveals another layer of the pattern. Their hunting strategies were highly effective within ecosystems rich in large herbivores. Stable isotope studies place them near the top of those food webs for much of their history. Success depended upon relationships among climate, vegetation, prey abundance, and human mobility remaining broadly familiar. As those relationships shifted, dependence on a narrower range of resources offered fewer alternatives when circumstances deteriorated. Paleontologists observe similar dynamics across many branches of life. Organisms finely tuned to a specific ecological arrangement often flourish. While that arrangement persists, their adaptations become increasingly refined, allowing extraordinary efficiency. Difficulty emerges when conditions move beyond the range those adaptations were built to handle. Flexibility becomes as important as excellence. Generalist species frequently survive environmental disruption because they can draw upon multiple strategies. Specialists often outperform them during stable periods. Evolution rewards both approaches under different circumstances. Neither represents superiority in an absolute sense. Each reflects a solution to a particular world. The Neanderthals stand among the most accomplished specialists ever produced within the human lineage. For hundreds of millennia, they mastered climates, landscapes, and challenges that would have overwhelmed many other populations. Their disappearance does not suggest inadequacy. It illustrates a principle visible throughout ecology. Adaptations are agreements with a specific set of conditions, and every agreement depends upon those conditions continuing to exist. As the pressures explored throughout this story converged, the balance that had sustained Neanderthal life for so long became increasingly difficult to maintain. The pattern is familiar to evolutionary history, even if the individuals living within it could never have seen the shape of the larger process surrounding them. There is a tendency, when looking backward across prehistory, to imagine extinction as proof of failure and survival as proof of superiority. The story feels neat. One human species remained, another disappeared. From a distance, it is tempting to see inevitability in that outcome, as though evolution had been moving toward a predetermined destination all along. The evidence gathered from Neanderthal bones, genomes, campsites, and vanished territories points towards something far less comforting. The record does not describe a species that lacked intelligence, adaptability, cooperation, or resilience. It describes a population that encountered a convergence of pressures larger than its capacity to absorb. Those pressures accumulated gradually, interacting with one another across thousands of years. Their disappearance emerged from vulnerability meeting circumstance, not from some simple ranking of worth. That realization turns attention toward our own lineage. Modern humans often think of themselves as fundamentally different from the populations that vanished. In biological terms, the separation is smaller than it appears. Our species carries its own history of demographic fragility. Genetic studies indicate that the group of humans who expanded beyond Africa was surprisingly small. A limited number of individuals contributed disproportionately to the ancestry of billions alive today. The traces of that bottleneck remain visible throughout the modern genome. Disease offers another reminder. Human history contains repeated episodes in which pathogens exposed weaknesses within populations that believed themselves secure. The Black Death swept through Eurasia during the 14th century. Influenza spread globally in 1918. The coronavirus pandemic, beginning in 2020, revealed how quickly disruption could move through an interconnected world. Scientific knowledge, advanced medicine, and international communication reduced some consequences, yet vulnerability remained visible. Connection itself introduces a different form of dependence. Earlier human societies relied primarily on local landscapes for survival. Modern civilization rests upon networks spanning continents and oceans. Food, energy, materials, and information move through systems of extraordinary complexity. Those systems provide abundance under normal conditions. Their scale also means that disturbances can propagate across enormous distances. Reliability becomes linked to countless relationships, extending far beyond any single community. Climate adds another layer to the comparison. Neanderthals experienced repeated environmental fluctuations during the late Pleistocene. Temperature shifts altered ecosystems, migration routes, and resource availability. Today, global climate patterns are changing once again. This time, the driving force is not orbital cycles or natural variability alone. Human activity has become a major geological influence, modifying atmospheric chemistry and reshaping environments across the planet. A striking contrast emerges from that fact. The Neanderthals adapted to conditions they did not create. Their world changed around them through processes entirely outside their control. Modern humans occupy a different position. The species influencing planetary systems is also the species dependent upon those same systems for long-term stability. Their bones, therefore, offer something more than a record of disappearance. They preserve evidence that no organism exists outside ecology, geography, genetics, and chance. Success at one moment does not guarantee permanence at the next. Survival depends upon maintaining flexibility when conditions shift and pressures begin to overlap. Seen through that lens, the Neanderthal story becomes less about a vanished relative and more about a recurring pattern in the history of life. Their remains endure as a reminder that dominance and security are not the same thing, and that every species, including our own, lives within limits that are easy to overlook while conditions remain favorable. Among all the evidence gathered from caves, bones, sediments, genomes, and ancient landscapes, there remains a boundary that science cannot cross. Measurements can estimate population size. Genetic analysis can reconstruct ancestry. Climate records can reveal environmental change with extraordinary precision. None of these tools can recover the private experience of an individual mind. At the edge of the Neanderthal story, that limitation becomes impossible to ignore. The archaeological record preserves actions. It does not preserve thoughts. A hearth indicates that a fire was maintained. A tool reveals that someone shaped stone with practiced skill. A burial suggests care, memory, and social attachment. These traces allow glimpses into behavior, yet the emotional texture behind those behaviors remains beyond direct observation. Finds from Shanidar Cave offer some of the strongest hints. Individuals survived injuries that would have required assistance from others. The dead appear to have been treated with a degree of attention extending beyond simple disposal. Such evidence suggests bonds capable of enduring hardship across years. It points toward communities in which individuals mattered to one another in ways that feel recognizable, even across immense spans of time. Those observations invite a deeper uncertainty. As Neanderthal territory contracted and neighboring groups disappeared from regions once occupied for generations, did anyone perceive a pattern larger than the challenges of ordinary life? A failed hunt, a harsh winter, the absence of familiar visitors, the discovery that a distant valley no longer held people, each event would have arrived separately. Whether those experiences accumulated into awareness of broader decline remains unknown. No fossil can answer that question. No genetic sequence carries such information. The evidence grows detailed when describing bodies and landscapes, then falls away entirely when approaching consciousness. What remains visible is continuity of effort. The final communities continued making Mousterian tools. Fires were maintained in occupied shelters. Resources were gathered from coastlines, hills, and hunting grounds. Daily life persisted. Survival demanded attention to immediate needs, just as it always had. Near the end of the record stands the engraved surface at Gorham's Cave. Repeated incisions form a deliberate cross-hatched pattern carved into bedrock. The work required intention and time. Someone chose to create it. Whether the engraving marked territory, memory, identity, belief, or something outside modern categories cannot be determined. The physical mark survives while its meaning does not. That absence gives the engraving unusual weight. It represents one of the final expressions we can confidently attribute to a Neanderthal mind. A person stood before stone, made a sequence of decisions, and left evidence of those decisions behind. Across tens of thousands of years, that act remains legible, even though its purpose has vanished. Then the record reaches its limit. Occupations cease. Bones no longer appear. Tool traditions stop accumulating. Archaeology observes the moment when evidence ends, though it cannot witness the final thoughts accompanying that ending. The stillness that follows carries no indication of surrender or failure. It marks the conclusion of a lineage that endured for hundreds of millennia, adapting, learning, caring for its members, and navigating changing worlds. Science can trace that conclusion with increasing accuracy. The inner experience of living through it remains beyond recovery, resting forever inside minds that no longer exist, except for the fragments of their inheritance that continue within us. An unusual arithmetic emerges from the genetic record. It begins with a statement that seems impossible at first glance. More Neanderthal DNA exists today than existed when Neanderthals themselves walked across Europe and Western Asia. The conclusion comes from scale. During their long history, Neanderthal populations were never especially numerous. Genetic studies suggest that even during favorable periods, their total numbers were modest compared with later human populations. Across hundreds of thousands of years, communities expanded and contracted, yet the species probably never exceeded roughly 150,000 individuals at any one time. Today, the situation is entirely different. Outside Africa, billions of people carry inherited fragments of Neanderthal ancestry. Most non-African individuals possess approximately 2% Neanderthal DNA, though the exact amount varies from person to person. When that small fraction is multiplied across a global population measured in billions, the cumulative quantity of surviving Neanderthal genetic material becomes enormous. Distributed through living humanity is a greater total reservoir of Neanderthal DNA than could ever have been contained within the comparatively small population from which it originated. This fact can create the impression that Neanderthals somehow endured through absorption. The reality is more complex. What persists is not a preserved population. It is a collection of fragments dispersed through another lineage. The original arrangement, the complete genetic architecture that defined a Neanderthal individual, no longer exists. Pieces remain, but the whole does not. Those surviving pieces were not retained by chance alone. Across roughly 40,000 years, natural selection continuously filtered inherited variants. Some fragments offered advantages in the environments encountered by expanding human populations. Others gradually disappeared. The surviving inheritance therefore represents a selected archive rather than a complete copy. Among the fragments most likely to persist were genes associated with immune function. Some helped recognize pathogens present across Eurasia. Others influenced skin biology, pigmentation, fat metabolism, and physiological responses shaped by northern climates. These variants became woven into human populations because they contributed something useful under particular conditions. A different category of inheritance left fewer traces. Whatever genetic combinations contributed to uniquely Neanderthal patterns of cognition, perception, social organization, or behavior were tied to an entire genomic context that no longer exists. Genes rarely operate in isolation. They interact through networks built across evolutionary time. Once the larger framework disappeared, many components lost the conditions that had given them meaning. Natural selection carries no memory of origins. It does not preserve traits because they belonged to a vanished people. It preserves traits that continue to function within present populations. Fragments that improved survival or reproduction remained. Fragments that provided no advantage gradually faded from the genetic landscape. Seen from this perspective, the Neanderthal story becomes neither complete extinction nor true survival. Their biological legacy passed into another lineage and continued its journey there. Yet the inheritance reaching the present is selective, incomplete, and transformed by thousands of generations of subsequent evolution. The DNA carried within living people, therefore, does not resurrect Neanderthals. It reveals that pieces of their history remain embedded within us, separated from the larger pattern that once bound them together. What survived was not the species itself, but scattered genetic echoes, preserved because they served a future their original owners would never see. A strand of DNA passes from parent to child without regard for the stories people later tell about it. It carries no memory of borders between species, no awareness of extinction, no understanding of identity. It persists where persistence is possible. Across tens of thousands of years, that persistence has left a record inside every genome descended from the meeting between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Seen through that lens, the modern human body becomes something more layered than it first appears. It is not a structure assembled from a single source. It resembles a manuscript written across many generations, where traces of earlier writing remain visible beneath later editions. The final text can be read on its own, yet fragments of previous chapters still shape every page. When Homo sapiens entered Eurasia, they encountered environments unlike those their ancestors had known in Africa. New climates, unfamiliar seasons, and novel pathogens formed a biological landscape already inhabited by Neanderthals. For roughly 300,000 years, Neanderthal populations had been adapting to those conditions. Their immune systems had accumulated solutions to local challenges through countless generations of natural selection. Some of those solutions entered human populations through interbreeding. The immune systems of many people living today still contain variants inherited from that exchange. Certain regions of the genome associated with pathogen recognition carry signatures that trace back to Neanderthal ancestry. Those inherited fragments became part of the biological toolkit that helped later populations navigate northern environments. The same pattern appears elsewhere in the body. Variants linked to skin biology, pigmentation, fat metabolism, and responses to colder climates reveal contributions from a lineage that no longer exists as a distinct people. Certain disease resistances emerged from that inheritance. Certain vulnerabilities emerged as well. The genetic legacy carried into the present is neither entirely beneficial nor entirely costly. It is a mixture shaped by circumstances that changed repeatedly across millennia. Looking across this evidence, the boundary between Neanderthals and modern humans begins to appear less rigid than popular imagination often suggests. They were separate lineages with their own histories, adaptations, and evolutionary paths. Even so, they were not sealed worlds. Genes crossed between them, children were born, descendants survived. Biological information moved from one population into another and continued onward through time. That reality reshapes the meaning of extinction. One lineage disappeared as a distinct population. Its language is lost, its traditions ended, its communities gone. At the same time, pieces of that lineage remained embedded within those who endured. The outcome was neither complete replacement nor complete continuity. It was something more intricate. For generations, the Neanderthal story was often framed as a contest with winners and losers. The genetic record paints a different picture. Competition existed, demographic pressures existed, ecological change exerted its influence, yet alongside those forces was exchange, inheritance, and incorporation. The species that emerged from that period carried traces of both histories within a single body. Perhaps that is why the distinction between loss and integration remains difficult to separate. One narrative speaks of disappearance, another speaks of continuation through transformation. The evidence supports elements of both. Modern humanity is not solely the product of Homo sapiens standing alone. It is the product of encounters, mixtures, and inheritances that left their marks in flesh, blood, and DNA, where fragments of an older lineage still travel through the world today. A definition can settle a scientific dispute while leaving a deeper uncertainty untouched. In the case of the Neanderthals, science can describe when they disappeared, how their populations declined, what pressures accumulated against them, and what traces remain today. The larger question rests beyond measurement. It concerns the meaning of disappearance itself. According to the formal biological definition, the answer is straightforward. Homo neanderthalensis ceased to exist as a reproductively independent species approximately 39,000 years ago. Their populations vanished from the archaeological record. Their communities no longer produced descendants identifiable as Neanderthals. By the standards used in biology, paleontology, and conservation science, that outcome qualifies as extinction. For many species, the definition feels complete. A trilobite leaves no descendants. A non avian dinosaur leaves only distant evolutionary relatives. A vanished organism disappears from the world and survives only through fossils, impressions, and traces preserved in stone. The boundary between existence and absence appears clear. The Neanderthal case resists that clarity. Across billions of living people, fragments of Neanderthal DNA continue their journey through time. Those fragments are not dormant relics. They participate in immune responses, influence physiology, contribute to patterns of variation, and shape outcomes that unfold inside living bodies every day. The biological legacy of Neanderthals remains active within a species that still covers the planet. Geneticists sometimes use the term ghost lineage to describe populations that are no longer visible through fossils alone, but can be detected through the genetic signatures they left behind. Such lineages reveal themselves indirectly, like footprints preserved after the traveler has passed beyond the horizon. In a precise sense, Neanderthals occupy that category. Their independent existence ended, yet their inheritance remains woven into the architecture of modern humanity. At this point, science reaches the edge of its authority. Data can establish the transfer of genes, genomes can quantify ancestry, models can estimate population histories. None of those tools can determine which word best describes the outcome. One interpretation emphasizes extinction. A distinct human lineage, shaped across hundreds of thousands of years, ceased to exist as itself. Its communities vanished, its traditions ended. Its perspective on the world disappeared beyond recovery. The continuity that sustained Neanderthal identity came to a close. Another interpretation emphasizes transformation. Genetic material crossed into a successor population and continued forward. Biological contributions persisted. Elements of one lineage became part of another. In that view, something endured, altered almost beyond recognition, yet still present. Both perspectives emerge from the same evidence. Neither fully captures the whole picture. Human language evolved to describe categories that are usually separate. Survival and extinction occupy different boxes. Presence and absence appear mutually exclusive. The Neanderthal story slips between those boundaries. It describes persistence without identity, inheritance without continuity, and influence without independent existence. Whatever term is chosen, one reality remains unchanged. For roughly 300,000 years, there existed a particular way of being human. There were Neanderthal children learning from Neanderthal elders, Neanderthal communities gathering around fires, Neanderthal minds interpreting landscapes, relationships, memories, and symbols through experiences unique to their lineage. That complete world ended. What remains is real. The fragments endure. The whole does not. The story began with a puzzle that seemed difficult to reconcile. How could a human species so resilient, so physically capable, and so thoroughly adapted to some of the harshest environments on Earth disappear from the world. Across the course of this journey, the evidence revealed a lineage of extraordinary endurance. Neanderthals survived repeated glacial cycles that transformed landscapes again and again. They endured conditions that would have challenged any human population. For hundreds of thousands of years, they hunted large game across cold grasslands, navigated shifting climates, cared for injured companions, and maintained communities across immense stretches of Eurasia. Long before the first city rose from river valleys, they were burying their dead. Long before written language, they were shaping stone with practiced precision, producing adhesives through controlled chemical processes, twisting plant fibers into cordage, and leaving deliberate marks on cave walls. Their world contained mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, and sweeping ice age horizons. Within that world, they flourished. Then the record changes. Around 39,000 years ago, the traces become difficult to find. Occupied sites cease to be occupied. Hearths that once glowed no longer receive fresh fuel. Tool traditions that had persisted across countless generations reach their final expression. The continuity breaks, leaving behind a gap that extends to the present day. The weight of that absence carries a particular meaning. It is not the absence left by incompetence. It is not the consequence of weakness. The evidence assembled from genetics, archaeology, climatology, and ecology points toward something far more complex. A population already strained by isolation encountered several pressures at once. Genetic diversity narrowed. Disease moved between previously separated populations. Resources became less predictable. Competitors operated through larger social networks. Environmental disruptions added further strain. Demographic thresholds approached and were eventually crossed. No single event explains the ending. No final battle marks the conclusion. The process unfolded across generations. A hunting band became slightly smaller. A local population became slightly more isolated. A difficult season carried greater consequences than it once had. Tiny changes accumulated until recovery was no longer possible. Even during that decline, another process was taking place. Encounters between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens produced children. Genes crossed between lineages. Variants, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of Eurasian adaptation, entered human populations and continued forward through time. Those inherited fragments remain with us today. For people whose ancestry extends beyond Africa, Neanderthal DNA survives as functioning biology. It participates in immune responses. It contributes to metabolic processes. It influences traits connected to skin, physiology, and adaptation to particular environments. These are not museum pieces preserved behind glass. They are active components of living bodies. In that sense, the ending of the Neanderthal story differs from what anyone standing beside an ice age fire could have imagined. Their communities disappeared, their languages vanished, their traditions ended. Yet parts of the biological solutions they developed across 300,000 years continued their journey within another lineage. The strongest humans who ever lived are gone as a people. Their inheritance remains scattered across billions of lives, carried forward in fragments too small to see, still participating in the ancient work of helping a human body endure the world around it.